All right, what is good? Deepak Chona, SportsMed Analytics, bringing you today's NFL injury updates. Thank you very much for joining. Now let's get it popping. So we start with Sam LaPorta, and the timing on this really confirms that this was a moderate severity hamstring strain. He missed about 3 weeks in the preseason and training camp. Now, the good news is he's already back at practice, very likely playing week 1 at about 100%. Now, the key here is that the re-injury risk is going to be about 15% with these hamstring strains, and especially because his was about moderate severity. We find approximately, and again, there's a range to this, but that there's about a 5% risk per week missed. So the first 8 weeks of the season, mild re-injury risk, but wouldn't really drop Sam LaPorta from his probably tight end 1 position overall. Then we have Keenan Allen. Now, the comments here suggest he's got some sort of mild foot issue. They're a little bit vague. The real key, though, is him returning to practice at full strength on Wednesday. And if so, then he very likely plays week 1. Certainly the comments are suggesting that's the way this is trending. Keenan Allen, given his age, given his history, is a very high-risk player for the season. And one thing that JJ Zachariason and Field Yates brought up on a podcast together is that you sometimes look for drafting players who are going to be useful for you in pockets. And now Keenan Allen misses time, that becomes real value for Rome Odunze, probably a top 20 wide receiver. So thinking about that strategy in redraft league management is a little bit different than just looking at their total output for the season. Next up is Kyren Williams. Now, there's a lot of fuss being made about him potentially punt returning, and truthfully, that wouldn't really change our evaluation of him at all in both a performance and a risk standpoint. If you look at punt returning, most likely you're usually fair catching those, and there's probably about 1 to 2 punt returns per game. Furthermore, that in itself, I think, is less impactful than the fact that the Rams decided to draft Blake Corum and invest relatively heavily in the running back position. So that in combination with Sean McVay's comments suggests that they are bringing down Kyren Williams' workload overall, looking to load manage him somewhat this season. The other part about Williams is that he's had some recurrent foot and ankle issues early on in his career. And that in itself is also not a red flag, but definitely a little bit of a yellow, and you're looking at a second-round pick. So I would say mildly elevated relative risk at his ADP, although we certainly don't have any reason to suspect strongly that he's going to get injured. Then we have Kyler Murray. Optimism here is really rising. He's even in the dark horse comeback player of the year candidates on DraftKings. Now, the data here post ACL projects year 1 that you would have a dip in both your efficiency and the number of attempts as a quarterback. And then in year 2, which is where he is now, that this returns to your pre-injury rushing efficiency and explosiveness. And Kyler Murray has even come out and talked about this, meaning that he's said he didn't really trust his lateral movements, and cutting off of an ACL, changing direction, that sort of thing is really where you see the limitation. So Kyler Murray overall looking up from here. Then we have Mike Williams. Now, he is likely playing week 1, certainly has been trending that way all off season. The downside is that he's up there in age, and furthermore, even though he's likely playing week 1, he's likely to be on a snap count. So factoring in both the snap count and the dip in his efficiency, both of those are likely to be in the 20 to 25% range. So the data projects him to really need a solid amount of time to ramp back up, probably until about week 10. Next up is T. Higgins, and he's not injured, and we're glad to say he's not injured. You look at last year's stats, and I would say they're heavily impacted by injury. T. Higgins had a rib injury partway through the season early on. Before that, Joe Burrow had his calf issue, and then at the end of the season, or towards the sort of second half, Joe Burrow had that wrist injury. Now, when they were both healthy, there's really only a 2-game sample to work with. And during those 2 games, again, very limited sample, but 6.5 receptions, 90 yards per game. So we think T. Higgins is in for a bounce back year. And that, of course, assumes that Joe Burrow and T. Higgins can stay healthy. Davante Adams. Now, he's missed some practice. He missed a preseason game. A little bit unclear of a diagnosis here. The comments certainly suggest mild severity, and it's even been described as soreness. And with Davante Adams, relatively high durability history, meaning that he's been on injury reports and played through a lot of issues. So we would expect him to be active week 1. No strong reason to suggest that this is going to be a lingering issue. However, we would want to see that he is coming back to practice early this coming week. Next up is Tyler Lockett, and the concern on him is actually rising. So the practice reports are going to be key to his week 1 status, particularly that Wednesday, Thursday practice report. However, they're calling this a leg injury. He is up there in age at age 31. So given those two combinations, those two factors, he is a high in-season injury risk. And I think it's very wise to invest in JSN over Tyler Lockett, given the current situation that Lockett's dealing with. Also on the Seahawks, Zach Charbonnet. He was dealing with some back tightness, and this is, I would say, one level down from a back spasm. So the issue here is that there is some recurrence risk, and you can imagine as a running back, you're going to take all sorts of hits, and your back is going to be tightened up at various points. So there is a recurrence risk here. He is practicing now. He's very likely playing week 1 and likely without any production dip. So as long as he stays active, you usually don't see the productivity dip for running backs, but the key is, can he stay healthy all year? Next up, we have Tim Patrick. Hard not to root for a player coming off of these big of injuries. Of course, he was released from the Broncos last week. He's now on the Lions, which is promising in one sense in that he is likely to have opportunity if he can stay on the field. The question here is that he had a 2022 ACL right at the beginning of the season. Then same time last year tore his Achilles. That is such a brutal combo. That's basically the Klay Thompson combo. And if you look at it, he's age 30. He had average pre-injury athletic metrics for a wide receiver, about 50 to 60th percentile. So data projects a pretty significant dip, about 20-25% for Patrick. Next up is Joey Bosa of the Chargers. So week 1 would be 5 weeks post hand surgery. You often see a cast or a club on the hand for about 6 weeks to kind of protect the surgical site while it's healing. Now, the data would suggest a mild production dip, and it's a little bit limited data, but the data would suggest a mild production dip until about 2 weeks after the cast does come off. And the reason for that is once it comes off, you start really strengthening, and it usually takes a couple weeks to get that back. Now, even Joey Bosa with a production dip is still an elite player, so certainly expect to see him out there for week 1. Next up is Dre Greenlaw. He's on the PUP. As you may remember, he tore his Achilles. There's a lot of variability on the data for timeline to return here, and we're seeing these timelines getting pushed up and up. You see Jalen Phillips came back early. Cam Akers, of course, had come back early. James Robinson before him or after him. Now, the current thinking, at least our thinking, is that he misses 4 weeks on the PUP, of course, and then after that, probably November is pretty realistic in terms of timeline to return. But for a pass rusher, you would expect a pretty heavy dip here in terms of his production. So that is the downside on Dre Greenlaw. There's also a little bit of an increased injury risk. Relatively mild injuries do tend to occur when you haven't been in, let's say, football shape. So the first 6 weeks, you do tend to see a little more common soft tissue strains for players like this returning off a major injury. Next up, we have the Bengals' Amarius Mims. So he's their first-round rookie tackle that they brought in to help protect Joe Burrow. He strained his pec early on, and it seems like at least a moderate, somewhat high-severity pec strain based on the timeline that they reported. Now, the average here is going to be about 4 weeks, which would give him a chance for a week 1 or week 2 return. Typically see a low performance impact when offensive linemen are back, but the key is, especially with an offensive lineman, for these injuries, you're constantly firing your pec to engage in blocks. So it's going to be a high re-injury risk if they rush him back. Then another offensive lineman, Lions, Penei Sewell. So the idea here is that he went out of practice with a foot and ankle issue. He had a negative MRI, which is great news. And then he was diagnosed with what sounds like a low ankle sprain. That usually would not hold offensive linemen back, meaning that he would likely be playing week 1 at about 100%. There is a little bit of a re-injury risk here, about 10%, so relatively mild. But Penei Sewell, overall, looking promising so far. Then we have Cardinals' Darius Robinson. He has a calf strain, and the reports suggest that it's at least a moderate severity. The average on these would be about 4 weeks, but the key is with rushing back, you have a relatively high risk of re-injury. Now, he's a young player, and we would expect them to go slow because these can turn bad pretty fast. You saw Joe Burrow last year. We've seen Achilles tears really derail people's careers. So we don't want to rush Darius Robinson back, and that's kind of why we're expecting a slow return here. Next up, we have DJ Reader, now of the Lions, formerly of the Bengals. He has passed his physical. I would say he still needs likely to ramp up, so probably returning week 2 or 3 is the most realistic. The key, though, is that he tore his quad tendon. And when you do that, there's a pretty big production dip for the first year back. So it's about 20%. That's recorded so far in our data. And it's one of those things where DJ Reader will probably be seeing a little bit of a ramp up, maybe not a full workload right away. Next up, River Cracraft, in line to potentially have the wide receiver 3 role for Miami, which could be quite valuable, especially if OBJ continues to be out. Now, they didn't report what the actual injury was. They just said it's a shoulder injury, it's a severe shoulder injury. And those comments, plus the fact that they moved him to the IR pretty fast, really confirm that this is high severity. The most concerning possibility here is probably a shoulder dislocation. And the reason is that carries a relatively high recurrence risk. So keeping that in mind, we think that there is a possibility that Cracraft comes back after he's eligible off the PUP. But with that being said, high recurrence risk is really the key concern here. And then last but not least, we have Roman Wilson. So the video and images on Roman Wilson suggested that he had a high ankle several weeks ago. He's now practicing, and in a limited form, we would expect him to get back to somewhat of increased practice participation this coming week, and really watching those practice reports is the key. However, the data so far, including his progression, does suggest that he would probably be playing week 1. And with that, coming off a high ankle for a wide receiver, typically do see about a 15% efficiency and target dip, meaning that 15% fewer targets and 15% less efficiency. So overall, that comes out to about a 20-25% overall production hit. Now, with Roman Wilson, the key will be re-injury risk, and that's probably the reason they don't rush these back in general. For a high ankle sprain, the concern is cutting, pivoting, and that's obviously key for what a wide receiver has to do. So we have to imagine that if there's concern this week in practice, then they're going to go slow with him. However, we would think that Roman Wilson has a good chance of being active week 1. And that's all we got for today. Thank you for tuning in. And as always, drop your questions in the comments section, and hit us up on Twitter, Instagram, and we will be in touch soon. Peace.